They thought I wouldn't find out. 3 weeks of visiting friends while strangers slept in my bed, used my bathroom, and ate breakfast at my kitchen table. But when I discovered what my own children had done behind my back, I realized they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I still held the keys to everything they thought they owned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The email notification popped up on my phone while I was watering the geraniums on Mrs. Henderson's front porch. Your Airbnb guest, Derek, has checked in. It read, complete with a cheerful thumbs-up emoji. I stared at the screen, water from the watering can dripping onto my shoes, creating small dark spots on the concrete. I don't have an Airbnb account. My hands trembled slightly as I set down the watering can and walked to the white wicker chair where I'd left my reading glasses. I put them on and read the message again. Slower this time, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there it was, clear as day with a photo attached, showing a man in his 30s standing in what looked distinctly like my bedroom, giving a thumbs up to the camera. My bedroom with the quilt my mother had sewn for my wedding day draped across the foot of the bed, and my late husband's fishing trophies visible on the dresser in the background. I called my daughter immediately. Sophie, honey, I need to ask you something strange, I said when she picked up, trying to keep my voice level. Are you at your apartment right now? Of course, Mom. Why? And Marcus, is he at his place? There was a pause. Yes, he's working late at the office. Mom, what's going on? You sound weird. I took a deep breath. I just got a notification that someone named Derek has checked into an Airbnb at my house. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Sophie's voice came back, higher pitched and faster than usual. That's impossible. There must be some mistake. Maybe it's a scam email or something. But I was already walking. Mrs. Henderson lived only 4 blocks from my house, and I'd made this walk 1,000 times over the past year since she'd broken her hip. As I walked, I could feel something cold settling in my stomach, the way it had when I'd found out about Robert's cancer, or when the bank had called about the mortgage being behind. That feeling when you know your world is about to shift, but you haven't quite grasped how far it's going to fall. My house sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial, with blue shutters that Robert had painted himself the summer before he died. The driveway was empty, which wasn't unusual since I didn't drive much anymore, but there was a red Honda Civic parked on the street that I didn't recognize. I stood at the edge of my front yard, keys clutched in my hand, staring at my own home like it belonged to someone else. The front door was locked, which seemed absurd under the circumstances, but I used my key and stepped inside. The house smelled different. Not bad, exactly, but unfamiliar. Like someone else's laundry detergent and a cologne I didn't recognize. I walked through the living room, noting that the throw pillows were arranged differently, and there was a coffee mug on the side table that wasn't one of mine. The voices came from upstairs. A man's voice laughing, and then the sound of someone typing on a laptop. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking in the familiar way that usually comforted me, but now sounded like an alarm, announcing my presence in my own home. My bedroom door was open. A man who looked to be in his early 30s sat on my bed, laptop balanced on his knees, talking animatedly into his phone. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt, and his suitcase was open on the floor beside my dresser. When he saw me standing in the doorway, his face went from cheerful to confused, to slightly alarmed. "Oh hey," he said, ending his call quickly. "Are you the cleaning lady? I wasn't expecting anyone today." I blinked at him. "I'm Mabel Crawford. This is my house." His eyebrows shot up. "Your house? But I booked this room through Sophie. She said she was the homeowner. I paid $300 for the week." He pulled out his phone and showed me a screen full of messages. "Look, here's our whole conversation. She even sent me the door code." I stared at the messages, reading my daughter's name at the top of the conversation thread. The profile picture showed a stock photo of the house, taken from an angle that made it look larger and more upscale than it actually was. The listing described it as charming family home in quiet neighborhood, perfect for business travelers and tourists. Host Sophie is friendly, and responsive. She gave you a door code, I asked. Yeah, for the smart lock. Said it was easier than coordinating key pickup. He gestured toward the front door. Worked perfectly. I thought about the new doorknob that had appeared on my front door 2 months ago. Sophie had said it was a security upgrade, a birthday gift, to help me feel safer living alone. She'd insisted on programming it herself, saying the technology was too complicated for someone my age to figure out. Derek was still talking, explaining about his business trip, and how he'd specifically chosen this place because the host had assured him it would be quiet and private. But I wasn't really listening anymore. I was thinking about all the times in the past month that Sophie and Marcus had encouraged me to visit my sister in Portland, or to take that senior center day trip to the coast, or to spend a few days helping with Mrs. Henderson. How they'd both insisted I needed to get out more, socialize, stop staying cooped up in the house all the time. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said finally. This is my bedroom, my house, I live here. Derek's face went pale. But Sophie said, she said she owned the place. She's been renting it out for weeks. I'm not the first guest. He scrolled through his phone frantically. Look, she has 5-star reviews, people talking about how comfortable the bed is, how well stocked the kitchen is. Someone even left a review about the homemade cookies that were waiting for them. My grandmother's chocolate chip cookie recipe, the one I'd taught Sophie when she was 12. I felt something sharp twist in my chest. How many weeks? I asked. I don't know. Let me check. He tapped his phone. Looks like the first review was posted about 3 weeks ago. There have been at least 6 different guests since then. 3 weeks, while I'd been dutifully visiting Miss Henderson every other day, taking those senior center trips I didn't really want to take, helping my neighbor organize her late husband's belongings. 3 weeks of strangers sleeping in my bed, using my shower, eating food from my refrigerator. Strangers who thought my daughter owned my house. I need to make some phone calls, I said. Would you mind giving me a few minutes? Derek was already packing. This is crazy. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Sophie seemed so legitimate, so professional. She answered all my questions, sent me check-in instructions, even recommended restaurants in the area. I walked downstairs and sat in Robert's old recliner, the one piece of furniture my children had never suggested I replace or donate. My hands shook as I dialed Marcus's number. Mom, didn't Sophie just talk to you? Is everything okay? Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth. Have you and Sophie been renting out my house on Airbnb? The pause was so long I could have counted to 20. When he finally spoke, his voice had that careful tone he'd used as a teenager, when he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. Mom, let me explain. That's a yes. It's not what you think. We were trying to help. You've been so lonely since Dad died, and we thought getting you out of the house more would be good for you. The rental income was just covering your expenses. While you were gone, it wasn't like we were keeping the money. You thought I was too lonely, so you rented out my bedroom to strangers. We were going to tell you eventually. We just wanted to see if it worked out first. Sophie set everything up, made sure the guests were respectful, thoroughly vetted. She even cleaned the house after each stay, so you'd never know. I looked around my living room, noticing details I'd missed before. The vacuum lines in the carpet were different from how I usually made them. The magazines on the coffee table were stacked differently. Even the angle of the reading lamp had been adjusted. How much money, Marcus? How much have you made renting out my house? Another pause. I don't know the exact amount. Sophie handles all the financial stuff. But it's not about the money, Mom. It's about getting you involved in life again. I hung up without saying goodbye, and immediately called Sophie. This time she didn't answer. I called again. Voicemail. I tried Marcus back, but he didn't pick up either. Derek came downstairs with his suitcase, looking embarrassed and uncomfortable. I've canceled the rest of my stay and booked a hotel room. I'm really sorry about this whole situation. Your daughter seemed so nice and professional. I honestly had no idea this wasn't legitimate. I walked him to the door, apologizing repeatedly, even though none of this was my fault. After he left, I stood in my living room, looking at my own home like I was seeing it for the first time. Everything was in its place, but nothing felt right. The house that had been my sanctuary, the place where I'd raised my children and cared for my dying husband. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Had been turned into a commodity without my knowledge or consent. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The comforter was made military crisp, the way I never made it. Sophie had always been particular about things like that, even as a child. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and found everything exactly where I'd left it. My reading glasses case, the bottle of lotion, the photo of Robert and me on our 30th anniversary. But somehow knowing that strangers had been sleeping 2 feet away from these intimate pieces of my life made me feel violated in a way I couldn't quite articulate. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Mom, Marcus told me what happened. Can we please talk? There's a lot you don't understand." I turned off my phone and went downstairs to make myself a cup of tea. As I waited for the water to boil, I noticed that my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle that Robert had bought me at a craft fair years ago, was in the dishwasher. Someone else had used it, washed it, put it away. The violation felt complete. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started making lists. Not emotional lists, not angry lists, but factual ones. Dates when my children had encouraged me to leave the house, the new smart lock installation date, the mysterious improvements that had appeared in my home over the past few weeks, the fresh flowers that Sophie said she'd bought just because, the upgraded Wi-Fi that Marcus said was a surprise gift, the new coffee maker that appeared with a note saying it was an early birthday present. I also started thinking about money, not the money they'd made from my house, but the money I'd been giving them, Sophie's car payment, that I'd been covering for the past 6 months, because she said her marketing job wasn't paying enough, the $5,000 I'd lent Marcus for his security deposit on his new apartment, the credit card I'd co-signed for Sophie's business venture, the one that was supposedly going to make her financially independent. But most of all, I thought about the trust fund. Robert had been meticulous about estate planning, especially after his diagnosis. We'd worked with a lawyer to set up a trust that would provide for me during my lifetime and then pass to our children after my death. But he'd also insisted on including what he called a flexibility clause, a provision that allowed me to modify the distribution of the trust assets if circumstances changed. I'd never really paid attention to the details because it had seemed so far in the future, so hypothetical. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen with strangers' fingerprints still fresh on my coffee mug, the flexibility clause didn't seem hypothetical anymore. It seemed like exactly the kind of forward-thinking provision that Robert would have included, knowing that life has a way of revealing people's true character when they think no one is watching. I walked to the den and opened the filing cabinet where we kept all our important paper. The trust documents were in a manila folder labeled estate planning, in Robert's careful handwriting. I spread the pages across his old desk and started reading, really reading. For the first time since we'd signed them, the flexibility clause was on page 7. It was written in the dense legal language that lawyers love, but the basic meaning was clear. I had the authority to modify the trust distribution at any time, for any reason, as long as I followed certain procedural requirements and provided written notice to all beneficiaries. I thought about Derek, frantically packing his suitcase in my bedroom, apologizing for something that wasn't his fault. I thought about the other guests who had stayed here, the ones who had left reviews praising the homemade cookies and the comfortable bed. My cookies baked with ingredients I'd paid for, in my kitchen, my bed with sheets I'd washed and pillowcases I'd ironed. But mostly I thought about the casual way Marcus had said, it wasn't like we were keeping the money, as if the fact that they were depositing rental income from my property into their own accounts was somehow a favor they were doing me. I folded the trust documents and put them back in the folder, then I walked upstairs, changed into my nightgown, and went to bed. But I didn't. I lay there thinking about all the ways my children had been managing my life lately, all the decisions they'd been making for me, all the times they'd told me what was best for me, without bothering to ask what I want. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard between them at Christmas, when they didn't know I was listening. Sophie saying something about how I was getting fragile, and Marcus agreeing that they needed to start taking more responsibility for Mom's situation. At the time, I'd been touched by their concern. Now I wondered if they'd been talking about taking responsibility for my situation, or taking control of it. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made coffee in my apparently upgraded coffee maker, sat at my kitchen table, and called the lawyer who had helped Robert and me set up the trust. "Mrs. Crawford," he said warmly when his secretary put me through, "it's good to hear from you. How can I help?" "I need to discuss the flexibility clause in my trust. Specifically, I need to understand exactly what I can and cannot do with those provisions." There was a pause. "Of course. Are you thinking about making some changes?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things," I said. "But first, I need to understand my options." An hour later, I had my answers. The flexibility clause was even more comprehensive than I'd realized. I could modify not just the final distribution of the trust assets, but also any ongoing financial support that was being provided to beneficiaries during my lifetime. The lawyer explained that Robert had insisted on these broad powers specifically to ensure that I would never be left without recourse if circumstances changed. He was very concerned about protecting your autonomy. The lawyer said he wanted to make sure you always had the ability to make decisions about your own financial affairs, regardless of what anyone else thought was best for you. After I hung up with the lawyer, I called my bank and asked them to send me detailed statements for all my accounts for the past 6 months. Then I called my credit card company and asked for the same thing. I wanted to see exactly how much money had been flowing from my accounts to my children's lives. While I waited for the statements to arrive, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through my house room by room, taking inventory, not just of my possessions, but of my life. The photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, the dishes in the cabinet, everything that made this place mine. In the guest bedroom, I found a small stack of thank you notes from Airbnb guests, tucked into the desk drawer. Notes praising Sophie's hospitality, thanking her for the fresh towels and the local restaurant recommendations. One guest had even left a small gift, a scented candle with a note saying, "Thank you for making our stay so comfortable. Your home is beautiful." But it wasn't Sophie's home, it was mine. That afternoon, Sophie finally called back. "Mom, please let me explain. I know this looks bad, but everything we did was for you." "Tell me about the money, Sophie." "What money?" "The money you've been collecting from renting out my house. Where is it?" She sighed. "It's in a separate account. We were saving it for you, for expenses and things you might need. We weren't spending it on ourselves." "Show me the account." "What? If you've been saving this money for me, in a separate account, then show me the account." "I want to see the statements." Another pause. "It's not that simple. The account is set up under the business license I got for the rental, for tax purposes. But the money is there, I promise." "What business license?" The pause stretched longer this time. "I had to get a business license to run the Airbnb legally, and I had to use my name, because you don't have experience with this kind of thing, but it's all legitimate, all above board." I understood now. Sophie had established herself as the legal operator of a business being run out of my property, using my home as collateral for a venture I'd never agreed to participate in. She'd made herself the public face of an operation that was entirely dependent on my assets, but she'd structured it in a way that gave me no legal standing or control. "How much money, Sophie?" "I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, approximately, maybe 8 or 9,000 over the past 3 weeks, but like I said, it's all being saved for you." $8 or $9,000 in 3 weeks, more than I collected in Social Security in 3 months, generated by renting out my home to strangers while manipulating me into being absent so I wouldn't discover what they were doing. "I want to see the account statements by tomorrow," I said. "All of them. And I want to see the business license and any other paperwork you've filed related to this operation." "Mom, you're acting like we're criminals." "We were trying to help you. We were trying to get you more involved in life, and we thought the extra income would give you more financial security." "If you were trying to help me, why didn't you ask me first?" "Because you would have said no. You would have worried about having strangers in the house, worried about something going wrong, worried about all the things you always worry about. We wanted to show you that it could work before we asked you to make a decision. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my living room. They were right about one thing. I probably would have said no if they'd asked. I would have worried about strangers in my house, about something going wrong, about all the things I always worry about, but that was my choice to make. This was my house, my life, my decision, and they had taken that choice away from me, not because they thought I was incapable of making good decisions, but because they thought I would make decisions they disagreed with. That evening, Marcus showed up at my door with flowers and an expression I remembered from his childhood, the one he wore when he'd broken something and was hoping charm could fix it. "Mom, can we talk?" I let him in and we sat in the living room. He set the flowers on the coffee table and looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. "This is still your home," he said. "Nothing about that has changed. Sophie and I just thought we could help you maximize its potential while also encouraging you to get out more and engage with life." Maximize its potential. You know what I mean. You have this big house and you're here by yourself most of the time. It seemed like a waste, and we thought you might enjoy having a source of additional income. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of the boy who used to curl up next to me on this same couch to read bedtime story. He was there, underneath the careful words and the practiced expression, but he was buried under layers of rationalization and entitlement that I didn't recognize. "How long were you planning to continue this without telling me?" He shifted uncomfortably. "We were going to tell you. We just wanted to prove that it could work first." Sophie thought maybe after a month or two, when you could see how much money we'd saved for you and how smoothly everything was running, you'd be excited about it. And if I wasn't excited about it, well then we'd stop. Obviously. But you'd already have the business license. You'd already have the established guest reviews and the booking history. You'd already have created a legitimate business using my property as collateral. It would be harder to stop than to continue. Marcus frowned. "You're making it sound like we were trying to steal from you. That's not what this was about." "What was it about?" "It was about helping you build a more active, engaged life. You've been so isolated since Dad died. We were worried about you getting depressed, getting too stuck in your routines. We thought this would force you to get out more, meet new people, have new experiences." I thought about Derek, the business traveler who'd been so apologetic about the misunderstanding. I thought about the thank you notes from guests who'd been impressed by Sophie's hospitality. I thought about the reviews praising the homemade cookies and the comfortable bed. "Did you eat the cookies?" I asked. "What?" The guests left reviews praising the homemade cookies that were waiting for them. "Did you and Sophie eat my cookies while you were preparing the house for strangers?" Marcus looked confused. "I don't know what you're talking about. I bake cookies every week. Chocolate chip, usually. Sometimes oatmeal raisin. I keep them in the blue tin on the kitchen counter." If Sophie was leaving cookies for guests, she was taking my cookies. "Mom, you're fixating on details that don't matter." But they did matter. Every detail mattered. The cookies were just one small thing, but they represented something larger. My children hadn't just taken my house, they'd taken my hospitality, my baking, my care, and presented it to strangers as their own offering. "I want you to leave now," I said. "Both of you. I want you to cancel any future bookings, refund any deposits, and shut down the Airbnb account. I want my house back." Marcus's face tightened. "Mom, I think you're overreacting. This isn't the disaster you're making it out to be. No one got hurt. Nothing was damaged. We actually improved a few things around the house, upgraded some stuff that needed upgrading anyway. Get out. Let's just talk about this rationally. Get out of my house." He stood slowly, like he was giving me time to change my mind. When I didn't, he picked up the flowers he'd brought and walked toward the door. "We love you, Mom. Everything we did was because we love you and want what's best for you. If you loved me, you would have asked me first." After he left, I deadbolted the front door and went upstairs to my bedroom. I stripped the bed completely, even though the sheets were clean, and remade it with my favorite set, the ones with the tiny blue flowers that Sophie had always said were too old-fashioned. I arranged the pillows the way I liked them, not the way that looked good in photos. I moved Robert's picture back to the exact spot on the nightstand where it belonged. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and called the lawyer again. I want to execute the flexibility clause, I said. I want to modify my trust. Are you sure about this, Mrs. Crawford? These changes can be difficult to reverse, I'm sure. How soon can we meet? The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old paper. The kind of smell that makes you feel like important decisions have been made within these walls for decades. I sat across from Margaret Thornfield, the estate attorney who had helped Robert and me navigate the complexities of our financial planning 5 years ago. She had aged gracefully, her silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the documents spread across her mahogany desk. The flexibility clause your husband insisted on including is quite comprehensive, she said, tapping her pen against the legal pad where she'd been taking notes. Most people don't think to include provisions this broad, but Robert was very specific about wanting to ensure you maintained complete control over your assets throughout your lifetime. I remembered that conversation now, sitting in this same office while Robert held my hand and asked detailed questions about scenarios that seemed far-fetched at the time. What if our children made poor financial decisions? What if they tried to pressure me into arrangements I wasn't comfortable with? What if circumstances changed in ways we couldn't predict? Margaret had explained each clause patiently, and Robert had nodded seriously, as if he could see into a future I couldn't imagine. He said something to me that day, I told Margaret. He said that the worst financial abuse often comes from the people who love you most, because they convince themselves they're doing it for your own good. Margaret nodded grimly. Your husband was a wise man. I see this situation more often than you might think. Adult children who gradually take control of their parents' assets, always with the best of intentions, until the parent realizes they've lost autonomy over their own life. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and uncapped her pen. Now, let's talk about exactly what changes you want to make to the trust. I had spent the previous 3 days thinking about this moment, making lists and checking bank statements that had arrived in the mail. The numbers were worse than I had imagined. Sophie's car payment that I'd been covering wasn't just a temporary arrangement to help her get back on her feet. It had been going on for 8 months. The credit card I'd co-signed for her business venture had a balance of nearly $15,000, with charges for everything from designer handbags to expensive dinners. Marcus's security deposit loan had somehow turned into ongoing rental assistance. I'd been sending him money every month for half a year without realizing it. I want to remove both Sophie and Marcus as primary beneficiaries, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I want to establish a new structure that requires them to demonstrate actual respect for my autonomy before they receive anything. Margaret made notes as I spoke. What kind of demonstration did you have in mind? I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, containing printouts of the Airbnb listing, photos of the business license Sophie had obtained without my knowledge, and a timeline I'd constructed of all the times they'd encouraged me to leave the house over the past month. I want them to understand that trust isn't automatic just because we share DNA. I want them to earn it back. That's certainly possible within the framework of your trust. We could establish conditional inheritance provisions, requiring specific actions or behaviors before distribution. What would you want those conditions to be? I had thought about this carefully. First, they need to provide a complete accounting of all money they've earned using my property, and transfer it to an account under my control. Second, they need to dissolve the business license and any other legal arrangements they've created using my house as collateral. Third, they need to acknowledge in writing that they violated my trust and explain how they plan to rebuild it. Margaret nodded approvingly. Those are reasonable and enforceable conditions. What happens if they refuse to meet these requirements? Then their inheritance goes to other people who have actually shown me respect and consideration over the years. I thought about Miss Henderson, my elderly neighbor who had never once suggested that I didn't know what was best for myself. I thought about Janet, My hairdresser who always asked about my life and listened to my answers like they mattered. I thought about the young woman at the grocery store who helped me load heavy bags into my car and never acted like my inability to lift 50 pounds of groceries meant I was incapable of managing my own affairs. I have some ideas about alternative beneficiaries, people who have treated me like a complete human being rather than a problem to be managed. Margaret smiled. I think your husband would be proud of you for using the tools he gave you to protect yourself. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the language for the trust modification. Margaret explained each section carefully, making sure I understood not just what the changes meant, but how they would be enforced and what recourse I would have if my children tried to challenge them legally. The beauty of the original trust structure is that it gives you broad discretionary power, she said. Your husband specifically designed it so that you wouldn't need anyone's permission or approval to make changes. You're not taking anything away from your children that was legally theirs. You're simply exercising your right to determine how your own assets will be distributed. When we finished, Margaret made copies of everything and explained the next step. I'll have the formal documents prepared by the end of the week. Once you sign them, the changes take effect immediately. Your children will receive notification letters explaining the new conditions and the timeline for meeting them. How long should I give them? I asked. That's entirely up to you. Some people prefer shorter timelines to encourage prompt action. Others prefer longer periods to allow for thoughtful consideration. What feels right to you? I thought about the 3 weeks they'd been renting out my house, the months they'd been taking money from my accounts, the countless times they'd made decisions about my life without consulting me. 60 days, that's enough time for them to understand that I'm serious, but not so long that they can procrastinate or try to manipulate the situation. After leaving Margaret's office, I drove to the bank and opened a new checking account, one that neither of my children had any knowledge of or access to. I transferred enough money to cover my living expenses for the next year, plus a cushion for emergencies. Then I called the credit card company and removed myself as a cosigner on Sophie's business card. Ma'am, removing yourself as a cosigner will make the primary cardholder fully responsible for the balance, the customer service representative explained. Are you sure you want to proceed? I'm absolutely sure. And you understand that any future charges or missed payments will not affect your credit score, but the primary cardholder will be solely liable for all debt. That's exactly what I want. I also called the bank that held Marcus's auto loan, the one I'd been co-signing payments for, and removed myself from that arrangement as well. It felt strange, cutting these financial ties that had seemed like natural expressions of maternal love just a week ago. But I was beginning to understand the difference between helping my children and enabling them to take advantage of me. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and thought about the conversation I'd overheard at Christmas, the one where Sophie and Marcus had discussed taking more responsibility for my situation. I wondered now if they'd been planning this Airbnb scheme even then, already seeing my house as an underutilized asset rather than my home. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Sophie. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to apologize. I know the way we handled the Airbnb situation wasn't ideal. We should have talked to you first. You should have asked my permission first. You're right. We should have asked your permission, but I hope you'll consider letting us continue the arrangement now that you know about it. The income really could be helpful for you, and we've worked out all the logistics. We could formalize everything, make you a full partner in the business. I almost laughed. A partner in a business that uses my house. A business that could provide you with steady income and help you stay engaged with the world. Mom, you're 74 years old. At some point you're going to need more help than you're comfortable asking for. This income stream could give you more options, more independence. There it was again, that casual assumption that my age automatically made me less capable of managing my own affairs. Sophie, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Of course. How much money have you made from renting out my house? Silent. Then, I told you, it's all being saved for you. That's not what I asked. I asked how much money you've made. About $12,000 total. But Mom, that money is sitting in the business account. We haven't touched $12,000, not the $8,000 or $9,000 she'd mentioned before. And I wondered what haven't touched it really meant. Did it mean the money was sitting in an account earning interest for me? Or did it mean they hadn't spent it on anything frivolous? There was a significant difference. I want to see the bank statements for that account, I said. Why are you being so suspicious? We're your children. We love you. Everything we've done has been to help you. If you love me and want to help me, you'll show me the bank statement. Another pause. Fine. I'll bring them over tomorrow. But Mom, I really hope you'll consider letting us continue this arrangement. We've built up great reviews, established relationships with regular guests. It would be a shame to throw all that away over a misunderstanding. After she hung up, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and looked around the space that strangers had been occupying for the past 3 weeks. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and counted the items inside: reading glasses, hand cream, tissues, the small jewelry box that held my wedding ring during the times when arthritis made wearing it uncomfortable. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, but somehow the space felt contaminated by the knowledge that other people had been sleeping here, using my bathroom, wearing my bathrobes. I thought about Sophie's phrase, throw all that away over a misunderstanding, as if my objection to having my house rented out without my knowledge was simply a failure to understand how wonderful the arrangement actually was, as if my desire to control my own property was an unreasonable obstacle to their business plan. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking action rather than simply reacting to circumstances other people had created for me. I made coffee, read the newspaper, and watered my plant. Normal activities, but they felt different somehow, more intentional. Sophie arrived just after lunch, carrying a manila folder and wearing the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eye. I brought the bank statements you wanted to see, she said, settling herself on the couch like she planned to stay for a while. I opened the folder and spread the statements across the coffee table. The business checking account had been opened 6 weeks ago, with an initial deposit of $50. Since then, there had been regular deposits ranging from $400 to $800, along with various expenses, cleaning supplies, upgraded bedding, a professional photography session, business license fees, and something called marketing and promotion costs. What are marketing and promotion costs? I asked. Advertising the listing, boosting it in search results, that kind of thing. You have to invest money to make money in this business. I added up the deposits and subtracted the expense. The current balance was about $8,000, significantly less than the $12,000 Sophie had claimed they'd earned. Where's the other $4,000? Sophie shifted uncomfortably. Some of the expenses came out of my personal account initially, so I reimbursed myself for those startup costs. What startup costs? The smart lock, the upgraded Wi-Fi, the new coffee maker, all the improvements we made to make the house more attractive to guests. I stared at her. You mean the gifts you said you were giving me? Those were business expenses. Well, yes, but they were also gifts. They're improvements that benefit you even when we're not renting the house. So you spent $4,000 of rental income from my house to buy improvements for my house, and you presented those improvements to me as gifts. Mom, you're making this sound deceptive, but it's really just good business practice. We invested the initial rental income back into the property to make it more competitive. That's how you build a sustainable business. I gathered up the bank statements and put them back in the folder. Whose name is on this business checking account? Mom. But like I said, it's being held for you. And the business license, also in my name, but only because I'm the one managing the day-to-day operations. And the Airbnb account. Same thing. But Mom, all of this can be changed. We can make you the official owner of everything. I just thought it would be easier to get started with everything under one name. I nodded slowly, understanding now how thoroughly they had established themselves as the legal operators of a business that was entirely dependent on my property. Even if I agreed to their proposal, even if I became a full partner in this venture, I would be joining a business structure that they had created and controlled, rather than participating as an equal partner in something we had built together. Sophie, I need you to shut down the Airbnb account and transfer this money to my checking account. Her face tightened. Mom, please think about this carefully. You're throwing away a good income stream because you're upset about how it started, but the past is the past. What matters now is moving forward in a way that benefits everyone. It benefits you and Marcus. I don't see how having strangers sleep in my bedroom benefits me. It benefits you financially. This income could make a huge difference in your retirement security. I thought about my bank statements, about the monthly transfers I'd been making to cover Sophie's car payment and Marcus's rent. I think I'm already providing enough retirement security, just not for myself. Sophie's expression hardened. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've been supporting both of you financially for months, and now you want me to be grateful that you found a way to generate income, using my house to cover the expenses I've been paying for you. That's not fair. We never asked you to help with our expense. You didn't have to ask, you just stopped paying them, and waited for me to cover the bills. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of this acknowledgement settling between us. Sophie looked down at her hands, and for the first time since this whole situation began, she looked genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply defensive. We weren't trying to take advantage of you, she said finally. Things have been tight for both of us, and we thought this Airbnb thing could help everyone. We could reduce our dependence on your help while creating a new income stream for you. By using my property without my permission and lying to me about where you were getting the money to repay me. We weren't lying. We were trying to solve the problem before we had to admit there was a problem. I understood this logic, the same reasoning that had probably justified every step of their deception. Don't tell Mom about the financial problems because she'll worry. Don't tell Mom about the financial problems because she'll worry. Sophie, I want you to cancel all future bookings and close the Airbnb account by the end of this week. Mom, please, we've worked so hard to build this up. The reviews are fantastic. We have repeat customers, everything is running smoothly. Can't we at least try it officially, with your full knowledge and participation? No, why not? Give me one good reason why this arrangement doesn't make sense for everyone involved. I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised and loved and supported through every challenge of her adult life, and realized that she genuinely didn't understand why I might object to having my home turned into a commercial enterprise without my consent. Because it's my house. And I should get to decide how it's used, but you're not using it efficiently. You're here by yourself most of the time, and there are 3 empty bedrooms that just sit vacant while you could be earning money from them. That's my choice to make, but it's not a rational choice. You're choosing emotional comfort over financial opportunity, and there it was, the fundamental disagreement that explained everything else. Sophie saw my attachment to my home, my desire to control my own living space, my preference for privacy over profit, as irrational emotions that needed to be managed rather than legitimate preferences that deserved respect. I don't have to be rational, I said. I have to be comfortable. And I'm not comfortable with strangers in my house. Sophie stood up, her frustration finally breaking through her carefully controlled demeanor. Fine, if that's really what you want, I'll shut everything down. But I think you're making a mistake. I think you're letting pride interfere with practical thinking. After she left, I sat alone in my living room, holding the folder of bank statements and thinking about the word efficient. According to Sophie's logic, I was using my house inefficiently, because I wasn't maximizing its income-generating potential. But efficiency had never been my goal for this space. Comfort was my goal, security was my goal. Having a place that belonged entirely to me, where I could move through my daily routines without considering how my actions might affect someone else's experience or business rating. I thought about Robert, about the conversations we'd had while he was dying about what my life would look like after he was gone. He'd worried about me being lonely, but he'd never suggested that the solution was to fill our house with strangers. He'd worried about me being financially secure, but he'd structured our assets to give me control rather than efficiency. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus. Mom, Sophie told me about your conversation today. I think there might be some misunderstanding about our intention. I don't think there's any misunderstanding. You rented out my house without my permission, established a business using my property as collateral, and lied to me about your reasons for encouraging me to leave home. We didn't lie. We just didn't tell you everything at once because we wanted to prove the concept first. That's lying, Marcus. It's strategic communication. We knew you'd have concerns, so we wanted to address those concerns with concrete evidence that the arrangement could work smoothly. Strategic communication, as if my objections to having my bedroom rented out to strangers were simply public relations problems to be managed rather than legitimate concerns to be respected. Marcus, How much money do I send you each month? What does that have to do with anything? How much? A pause. You help with my rent sometime, and you covered my car repair last month. But Mom, I pay you back when I can. When was the last time you paid me back for anything? Another pause, longer this time. Things have been tight, but this Airbnb income could help me get caught up on what I owe you. By renting out my house, by using an underutilized asset to generate income for everyone involved. There was that word again. Underutilized, as if my desire to live in my own house without commercial activity was a failure to optimize my resources rather than a personal preference about how I wanted to spend my remaining years. Marcus, I want you to understand something clearly. I'm 74 years old. I've worked hard my entire life, saved money, invested wisely, and planned carefully for my retirement. I don't need to rent out my bedroom to strangers to maintain my lifestyle. I need my children to stop treating my assets like their inheritance while I'm still alive to control them. Nobody's treating your assets like inheritance. We're trying to help you make smart financial decisions without consulting me about what I consider smart, because we knew you'd say no without considering the benefits. That's my right. It's my house and my decision. Marcus sighed. Okay. Fine. Sophie's shutting down the Airbnb. But I hope you'll reconsider once you see how much income you're giving up. After I hung up, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and stood in the doorway, looking at the space that would finally be mine again. I thought about Derek, the confused business traveler who had been so apologetic about the misunderstanding. I thought about all the other guests who had slept here, used my shower, made coffee in my kitchen, believing they were customers of a legitimate business rather than unknowing participants in my children's deception. Tomorrow, I would change the smart lock code. I would reclaim my space, my privacy, my right to move through my own home without wondering what evidence I might be leaving behind for someone else's customer review. It felt like a small victory, but an important one. That evening, I called Margaret Thornfield to check on the progress of the trust modifications. The documents are ready for your signature, she said. Would you like to schedule an appointment for tomorrow? Yes, I said. And Margaret? I want to add one more provision. What did you have in mind? I want to include language specifically prohibiting any future use of trust assets or trust-related property for commercial purposes without explicit written consent from the trustee. That's a wise addition. It will prevent any future situations like the one you're dealing with now. That's exactly the point. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Today, I would reclaim legal control of my own asset. Today, I would establish clear boundaries about how my property could and could not be used. Today, I would stop being a victim of my children's strategic communication and start being the author of my own financial story. But first, I had one more conversation to have. I picked up the phone and called my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Eleanor? It's Mabel Crawford. I wanted to ask you something. Have you noticed any unusual activity at my house over the past few weeks? Cars you didn't recognize, people coming and going. There was a pause. Well, I didn't want to pry, but I did notice some different cars in your driveway when you weren't home. I assumed you had hired some kind of service, maybe house sitters or something. Did you ever see Sophie or Marcus there when these strangers were around? A few times. I saw Sophie leaving one morning with cleaning supplies, and Marcus was there one evening talking to a young man on your front porch. I thought maybe they were helping you with some kind of home business, a home business. Even my neighbors had assumed that what they were witnessing was legitimate, authorized commercial activity rather than an elaborate deception. Sophie and Marcus had been so careful to maintain appearances, to make everything look official and above board, that no one had thought to question whether I knew what was happening in my own home. Eleanor? I need to tell you something, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep an eye on things for me going forward. I explained the situation, watching Eleanor's expression change from confusion to shock to anger on my behalf. Those children of yours should be ashamed, she said when I finished. Taking advantage of your trust like that. and making you feel like you were the problem for not wanting strangers in your house. The worst part is that they convinced themselves they were doing me a favor. That's how abuse always works, isn't it? The person doing it always has a good reason. Abuse? I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. But Eleanor was right. My children had systematically undermined my autonomy, violated my privacy, used my assets for their benefit, and manipulated me into compliance, all while telling themselves and me that they were acting out of love and concern. The fact that their intentions were good didn't change the fact that their actions were harmful. "What are you going to do now?" Eleanor asked. "I'm going to make sure it never happens again." That afternoon, I sat in Margaret Thornfield's office and signed the documents that would restructure my trust according to my own priorities, rather than my children's assumptions about what was best for me. The modifications were comprehensive. Sophie and Marcus were removed as primary beneficiaries and replaced with conditional inheritance provisions that required them to demonstrate respect for my autonomy before receiving anything. The trust assets would be protected from any future commercial use without my explicit consent, and if my children chose not to meet the conditions I had established, their inheritance would go to people who had consistently treated me like a competent adult, rather than a problem to be managed. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, as she notarized the final document. "Like I'm finally fighting back instead of just enduring." "Your children are going to receive notification letters next week explaining the changes and the conditions they need to meet. Are you prepared for their reaction?" I thought about Sophie's frustration when I refused to see the logic of her business plan. I thought about Marcus's insistence that strategic communication was different from lying. I thought about the casual way they had both dismissed my concerns as irrational emotional responses to obviously beneficial arrangements. "They're going to be angry," I said. "They're going to accuse me of being vindictive and unreasonable. They're going to tell me I'm making decisions based on hurt feelings rather than practical consideration. I'll remind them that practical considerations include respecting other people's right to make their own choices, even when you disagree with those choices. And if they refuse to meet your conditions." I thought about Miss Henderson, who had never once suggested that my age made me less capable of managing my own affairs. I thought about Janet at the hair salon, who always asked about my life like my experiences mattered. I thought about all the people who had treated me with basic respect and dignity, while my own children were busy managing my life for my own good. "Then they'll learn that actions have consequences, even when you're someone's child." Margaret smiled. "I think your husband would be very proud of you. I think he would be proud that I'm finally using the tools he gave me to protect myself." That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and looked around at the space that was finally completely mine again. Tomorrow, Sophie would shut down the Airbnb account and return my house to its intended purpose, being my home. Next week, my children would learn that their mother was not as powerless as they had assumed. And for the first time in months, I would go to sleep knowing that no strangers would be using my bedroom while I was visiting Mrs. Henderson or taking a senior center trip. The phone rang, but I didn't answer it. I had said everything I needed to say, made every decision I needed to make. Now it was time to let my children decide whether they wanted to be part of my life on terms that respected my dignity, or whether they preferred to continue treating me like an asset to be optimized rather than a person to be loved. Either way, I would be fine, because for the first time in months, I was the one in control of my own story. The notification letters arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to ensure there would be no question about whether Sophie and Marcus had received them. I watched from my kitchen window as the postal worker walked up to Sophie's apartment building 3 blocks away, then drove to Marcus's place across town. By noon, both of my children would know that their financial future had fundamentally changed, and that their mother was no longer the passive recipient of their strategic planning. I spent the morning baking bread, something I hadn't done in months. The rhythmic process of kneading dough gave my hands something to do while my mind wandered through the probable timeline of the day ahead. Sophie would call first. She always was the more impulsive of my 2 children, quick to react and slow to reflect. Marcus would take longer, probably consulting with friends or researching legal options before responding. But both calls would come, and both would follow predictable patterns of surprise, denial, and attempts to negotiate. The first call came at 12:40. "Mother, what the hell is this letter supposed to mean?" Sophie's voice was sharp with panic, all pretense of daughterly affection stripped away by the legal language she'd just finished reading. I continued kneading my bread dough, letting the silence stretch until she filled it herself. "It says here that you've removed Marcus and me as beneficiaries of your trust. It says we have 60 days to meet certain conditions, or we forfeit our inheritance entirely. This has to be some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake, Sophie. You can't be serious. You're willing to disinherit your own children because you're upset about a misunderstanding." I shaped the dough into a loaf and placed it in the buttered pan. "I haven't disinherited you. I've given you You can earn your inheritance by demonstrating that you understand the difference between helping me and controlling me." "This is insane. You're talking about millions of dollars here. I'm talking about respect. The money is secondary." "How can you say the money is secondary? This is our future we're talking about. Marcus and I have been counting on this inheritance to secure our retirement, buy homes, start families. You can't just take that away because your feelings got hurt." I slid the bread into the oven and set the timer. "You've been counting on money that doesn't belong to you yet, while simultaneously taking money that does belong to me now. Perhaps it's time to reconsider your financial planning strategy." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've removed myself as co-signer from your credit card and Marcus's car loan. It means the monthly transfers I've been making to cover your expenses will stop as of next week. It means you'll need to start supporting yourselves rather than treating my accounts like your personal subsidy program." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Sophie finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're cutting us off financially. I'm requiring you to be financially independent, the way adults generally are. But I can't afford my rent without your help. My business is just getting started, and the credit card payments are more than I can handle on my own." "Then perhaps you shouldn't have spent $15,000 on a credit card that I was responsible for paying. Those were business expenses, for a business that consisted of renting out my house without my permission. I'm not responsible for subsidizing your business ventures, especially when those ventures involve stealing from me." "We weren't stealing from you. We were trying to create income streams that would benefit everyone." I sat down at my kitchen table and looked out at the garden Robert and I had planted together 15 years ago. The roses were blooming despite my recent neglect, their pink petals bright against the green leaves, life persisting regardless of the chaos around. "Sophie, I want you to listen to me carefully. You established a business using my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent. You manipulated me into leaving my house so strangers could use my bedroom. You presented purchases made with rental income from my property as gifts you were giving me. You structured everything so that you maintained legal control while I bore all the financial risk. If that's not stealing, it's something very close to it. We were planning to make you a full partner once we proved the concept worked, without asking if I wanted to be in business with you, without considering whether I might prefer privacy to profit, without acknowledging that partnership requires consent, not just notification after the fact." Sophie's voice rose to the pitch it had reached when she was a teenager arguing about curfew. "So you're just going to destroy our relationship over this? You're going to let money come between us? You're the ones who brought money into our relationship, Sophie. You're the ones who decided that my assets were more important than my autonomy. I'm simply responding to the priorities you've already established. The conditions in this letter are ridiculous. You want us to provide a complete financial accounting of the Airbnb income. You want us to acknowledge wrongdoing in writing. You want us to explain how we plan to rebuild your trust. These aren't reasonable requests. They're punishment." I thought about Derek, the business traveler who had apologized profusely for sleeping in my bed without my permission. I thought about my neighbors, who had watched strangers come and go from my house and assumed I was running some kind of home business. I thought about the thank you notes from guests praising the hospitality they believed my daughter was providing. "The conditions are exactly what they need to be," I said. "If you want to inherit money from someone, you need to demonstrate that you respect that person's right to control their own assets while they're alive. But 60 days isn't enough time to meet these conditions. The financial accounting alone will take weeks to compile, then you'd better start working on it." Mom, please, can't we talk about this? Can't we find some kind of compromise? We are talking about it right now, and the compromise is that you get to choose whether you want to earn your inheritance or forfeit it. That's more generous than you were with my choice about how to use my own house. Sophie hung up without saying goodbye, but I wasn't surprised. When people are accustomed to getting their way through emotional manipulation, they often respond to boundaries with anger rather than reflection. The question was whether that anger would motivate her to meet my conditions, or simply convince her that I was being unreasonable. Marcus called 2 hours later, his voice carefully controlled in the way that meant he was working hard to manage his temper. Mom, I just got your letter. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what you're doing here. We're having it now, not over the phone. This is too important for a phone conversation. I'm coming over. That's fine, but my position isn't going to change based on the setting. We'll see about that. He arrived an hour later carrying a folder and wearing the kind of grim expression that made him look older than his 32 years. I let him in and offered him coffee, which he declined with a sharp shake of his head. Mom, I've been doing some research, and I think you need to understand the legal implications of what you're trying to do here. I understand them perfectly. I consulted with an estate attorney before making any changes. Did you tell this attorney that you were acting out of anger? Did you explain that you're making these decisions while you're emotionally compromised? I studied my son's face, looking for signs of the boy who used to build elaborate Lego cities on my kitchen floor. He was still there, somewhere underneath the careful calculation, but he was buried under layers of adult arrogance that I didn't remember helping to create. I told the attorney that I wanted to restructure my trust to better reflect my values and priorities. She said that was well within my rights as the trustor, but estate attorneys have an obligation to ensure that their clients are making decisions with clear judgment. If you were obviously acting out of spite or temporary emotional distress, she should have recommended a waiting period. Are you suggesting that I'm mentally incompetent, Marcus? I'm suggesting that you're making permanent decisions based on temporary feelings. The Airbnb situation is over. Sophie shut down the account yesterday. We've apologized for not handling it better. Why are you escalating this into something that affects our entire family's financial future? I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, taking my time to consider how to respond. Marcus followed me, his folder tucked under his arm like evidence in a legal proceeding. The Airbnb situation revealed something important about how you and Sophie view our relationship, I said finally. You see me as someone whose preferences and autonomy are obstacles to be managed, rather than rights to be respected. Shutting down the Airbnb doesn't change that fundamental problem. That's not true. We respect you. We love you. Everything we've done has been motivated by concern for your well-being. Concern for my well-being would have involved asking what I wanted rather than deciding what was best for me. Marcus opened his folder and pulled out several printed pages. I've been looking into the legal definition of undue influence in estate planning. There are specific criteria that courts use to determine whether someone has been pressured into making changes they wouldn't normally make. Are you planning to challenge my trust modifications in court? I'm planning to explore all available options to protect our family's financial security. I set down my water glass and looked directly at him. Let me make sure I understand your position. You believe that my decision to require you to demonstrate respect for my autonomy before inheriting my money constitutes undue influence. I think your decision to essentially blackmail your own children into admitting wrongdoing they don't believe they committed is questionable at best. And what would you call using my house as collateral for a business I didn't consent to participate in? Smart financial planning that you were too stubborn to consider objectively. There it was, the core assumption that had driven everything else. Marcus genuinely believed that my objection to his plans was a character flaw rather than a legitimate preference. He saw my desire to control my own property as stubbornness rather than autonomy. In his mind, I was the obstacle to obviously beneficial arrangements rather than the owner of assets that should be used according to my own priorities. Marcus, I want you to think about something. How would you feel if I moved into your apartment while you were at work and started renting out your bedroom to strangers? That's completely different. You don't live in my apartment, no, but I've been paying a significant portion of your rent for the past 6 months. By your logic, that gives me some ownership stake in how your space is used. His face reddened. The money you've given me was help, not investment. There's a difference, and the money you made renting out my house was business income, not theft. I understand the distinctions you're making. I just don't agree with them. Marcus sat down heavily at my kitchen table and rubbed his temples. Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this. We made a mistake with the Airbnb thing. We acknowledge that. But punishing us financially for the rest of our lives seems like a disproportionate response. I'm not punishing you. I'm giving you an opportunity to demonstrate that you understand why your actions were problematic and that you're committed to treating me with respect going forward. But the conditions you've set are impossible to meet. You want us to provide a complete financial accounting of income that was generated through a business we've already shut down. You want us to admit to wrongdoing in writing, which could have legal implications down the road. You want us to explain how we plan to rebuild trust, but you haven't given us any guidance about what that would look like. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out the folder where I kept copies of all the documents Margaret Thornfield had prepared. I set it on the table in front of Marcus and opened it to the page that outlined the specific conditions for inheritance. The financial accounting requirement is straightforward. You provide bank statements for the business account, receipts for all expenses, and a breakdown of how much money each of you personally received from the rental income. The written acknowledgement doesn't require you to admit to criminal activity. It requires you to acknowledge that you violated my trust and explain how you understand the impact of your action. The rebuilding plan is entirely up to you, but it needs to demonstrate that you understand the difference between helping me and controlling me. Marcus read through the conditions slowly, his frown deepening with each paragraph. This written acknowledgement could be used against us if you ever decided to pursue legal action. Are you worried about legal action because you believe you did something illegal? I'm worried about legal action because you're clearly angry, and people make unpredictable decisions when they're angry. I sat down across from him and folded my hands on the table. Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. I'm hurt. I'm concerned about what your actions reveal about how you see me and our relationship, but I'm not acting out of anger. I'm acting out of a desire to protect myself from future violations of my autonomy. But these conditions essentially force us to admit we were wrong about everything. They force you to acknowledge that you were wrong about something, specifically that you were wrong to use my property without my permission, wrong to manipulate me into compliance through deception, and wrong to assume that your judgment about my best interest should override my own preferences. And if we refuse to meet these conditions, then you forfeit your inheritance, and it goes to people who have consistently treated me with respect. Marcus stared at the documents for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Who would get our inheritance if we don't meet your conditions? I had given this considerable thought over the past week, researching the legal requirements for charitable bequests and individual gifts. Part of it would go to Henderson, who has been a kind and respectful neighbor for 15 years. Part would go to Janet, my hairdresser, who has never once suggested that my age makes me incapable of making good decisions. Part would establish a scholarship fund for students who are the first in their families to attend college, and part would go to the senior center, specifically to fund programs that support elderly people's independence, rather than assuming they need to be managed. You'd give our inheritance to your hairdresser. I'd give my money to people who have treated me like a complete human being rather than a problem to be solved. Marcus closed the folder and sat back in his chair. This is really happening. You're really going to disinherit us if we don't jump through these hoops. I'm really going to redirect my assets to people who respect my autonomy, if you choose not to demonstrate that you understand why respect matters. And there's no room for negotiation? No possibility of modifying these conditions? The conditions are exactly what they need to be. They're designed to determine whether you see me as a person with rights that deserve protection, or as an asset to be optimized for maximum benefit. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where he'd played as a child. Sophie is going to fight this. She's already talking about consulting with lawyers, maybe challenging your mental competency. Let her I've been thoroughly evaluated by the estate attorney, and my mental competency is well documented. More importantly, challenging my mental state in court would require Sophie to explain why she believes I'm incapable of managing my own affairs while simultaneously arguing that she should inherit the assets I'm supposedly too incompetent to control. She's desperate, Mom. The financial support you've been providing is the only thing keeping her afloat right now. Then perhaps it's time for her to learn to swim. Marcus turned back to face me. What about me? What happens if I meet your conditions but Sophie doesn't? Then you inherit your portion and Sophie forfeits hers. And if neither of us meets the conditions, then neither of you inherits anything, and my assets go to people who have earned them through consistent demonstration of respect and kindness. He nodded slowly, processing the finality of the situation. How much time do we have? 60 days from the date you received the notification letter. And if we need more time, then you'll need to demonstrate that you're making good faith efforts to meet the condition. But Marcus, I want to be clear about something. These conditions aren't designed to be punitive. They're designed to be educational. If you and Sophie truly don't understand why your actions were problematic, then you need more than just time to compile financial documents. You need to fundamentally reconsider how you think about relationships and respect and autonomy. Marcus picked up his folder and walked toward the door. I need to think about this. And I need to talk to Sophie about how we want to handle it. That's fine, but remember that you're each responsible for meeting the conditions individually. This isn't a group project where you can divide the work and share the credit. After he left, I sat in my kitchen and listened to the timer counting down the final minutes of my bread's baking time. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for months. Quiet and private and entirely mine. Tomorrow, I would wake up knowing that strangers weren't sleeping upstairs, that my children weren't scheming about how to optimize my assets, that my future was under my own control rather than subject to other people's strategic planning. That evening, Mrs. Henderson called to check on me. I saw Marcus leaving your house this afternoon. He looked upset. Is everything all right? Everything is exactly as it should be. Eleanor, for the first time in months. Good for you, dear. I've been worried about how those children of yours have been treating you lately. It's about time they learned that being someone's child doesn't give you the right to run their life. I should have set boundaries sooner, but better late than never. Indeed. And Mabel? If you need anything at all, you just let me know. I may be older than dirt, but I can still make a mean casserole and provide a sympathetic ear. After we hung up, I realized that Eleanor had offered me exactly what I needed: practical help when requested, emotional support without judgment, and respect for my ability to make my own decisions about my own life. The contrast with my children's approach couldn't have been starker. The next few days passed quietly. Sophie called twice, but I let both calls go to voicemail. Her messages were increasingly frantic, pleading for me to reconsider, explaining that she couldn't possibly meet the financial obligations I'd cut off, insisting that families should support each other through difficult times. But notably absent from her messages was any acknowledgement that she understood why I was upset or any commitment to changing her behavior going forward. Marcus sent a text message asking if I would be willing to meet with both of them together to discuss our options. I replied that there was nothing to discuss. The conditions were clearly stated in the legal documents, and they could either meet them or not. His response was a single word: understood. On Saturday morning, I was working in my garden when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my drive. A woman in her 40s emerged wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase. She walked up to my front door and rang the bell, then waited patiently while I finished watering my tomatoes and came to answer. Mrs. Crawford? My name is Linda Morris. I'm an attorney representing your daughter Sophie in the matter of your recent trust modifications. I dried my hands on my gardening apron and looked at her calmly. Sophie hired you to challenge my trust. Sophie hired me to explore options for protecting her interests and ensuring that your estate planning decisions are being made with proper legal guidance. I see. And what did you hope to accomplish by visiting me personally? Linda Morrison's smile was professionally warm but didn't reach her eyes. I was hoping we could have a conversation about your concerns and perhaps find a resolution that works for everyone involved. The resolution that works for everyone is clearly outlined in the documents Sophie received. She can meet the conditions I've established, or she can forfeit her inheritance. Those are her options. Miss Crawford, I understand that you're upset about the Airbnb situation, but making permanent changes to your estate plan while you're emotionally distressed may not be in your best interests. I stepped back and gestured for her to come inside. If Sophie wanted to play hardball, I was prepared to respond appropriately. Miss Morrison, I assume you've reviewed the trust documents. I have. Then you've seen that the modifications were prepared by Margaret Thornfield, who is one of the most respected estate attorneys in the state. You've also seen that the changes were made after a thorough consultation process and include specific legal protections to ensure they accurately reflect my intentions. Yes, but estate attorneys have an obligation to ensure their clients aren't making decisions under duress or undue influence. I led her into my living room and gestured for her to sit down. And you believe I was under duress when I decided to require my children to demonstrate respect for my autonomy before inheriting my money. I think it's possible that your judgment was compromised by anger about the Airbnb situation. Miss Morrison, let me ask you a hypothetical question. If your children used your house as collateral for a business venture without your knowledge or consent, manipulated you into leaving home so strangers could sleep in your bedroom, and then presented the financial benefits of this arrangement as a favor they were doing for you, how would you respond? She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That would certainly be upsetting. Would your response be to modify your estate plan to ensure they couldn't take similar liberties with your assets in the future? Possibly. Would that response indicate compromised judgment? Or would it indicate appropriate self-protection? Linda Morrison opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. Mrs. Crawford, Sophie is concerned that the conditions you've established are designed to be impossible to meet. She believes you're using your estate plan to punish her rather than to protect yourself. The conditions are designed to determine whether Sophie understands the difference between helping me and controlling me. If she believes that distinction is impossible to demonstrate, that tells me everything I need to know about whether she deserves to inherit my assets. But requiring a written admission of wrongdoing could have legal implications that extend beyond your family relationship. I thought about Derek, apologizing for sleeping in my bed because he didn't know he was participating in my children's deception. I thought about my neighbors who had watched the Airbnb guests come and go and assumed everything was legitimate. I thought about the thank you notes praising Sophie's hospitality for services that were actually mine. Miss Morrison, Sophie established a business using my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent. She manipulated me into leaving my house so strangers could use my private living space. She presented purchases made with income generated from my property as gifts she was giving. If acknowledging these facts in writing has legal implications for Sophie, perhaps she should have considered those implications before taking the actions. Mrs. Crawford, I think you need to understand that estate litigation can be expensive and emotionally devastating for family. If Sophie chooses to challenge your trust modifications in court, it could take years to resolve and cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. I looked at this woman who had come into my home to threaten me on behalf of my own daughter and felt something settle into place in my chest. Something cold and final. Miss Morrison, please make sure Sophie understands that I am prepared for legal challenges. Margaret Thornfield has assured me that my trust modifications are legally sound and properly executed. If Sophie wants to spend her money on lawyers rather than meeting the conditions I've established, that's her choice. But threatening me with litigation is not going to change my position. I'm not threatening you, Mrs. Crawford. I'm simply explaining the potential consequences of your current course of action. The potential consequences of my current course of action are that my children either learn to treat me with respect, or they forfeit their inheritance and my assets go to people who have consistently demonstrated that they understand how to treat elderly people with dignity. Uncomfortable with either outcome, Linda Morrison closed her briefcase and stood up. Mrs. Crawford, I hope you'll reconsider your position. Sophie loves you and wants to maintain a relationship with you, but she also needs to protect her financial future. If Sophie loves me and wants to maintain a relationship with me, she knows exactly what she needs to do. The conditions are clearly stated and completely achievable for someone who genuinely understands why respect matters. After the attorney left, I called Margaret Thornfield to report the visit. I'm not surprised, Margaret said. It's common for adult children to hire lawyers when they're removed from inheritance plans, especially when significant assets are involved. But your trust modifications are solid, and we documented your mental competency thoroughly. If Sophie wants to challenge them in court, she'll need to prove either that you lacked the mental capacity to make estate planning decisions, or that I failed in my professional obligation. Neither claim has merit. What should I do if she actually files a lawsuit? Let me handle it. But Mabel, I want you to understand something. The fact that Sophie hired an attorney to pressure you rather than simply meeting your conditions tells me that you made the right decision. Someone who respects your autonomy would work to rebuild your trust, not threaten you with legal action for exercising your rights. That evening I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow would mark 2 weeks since I'd discovered the Airbnb scheme, 1 week since I'd signed the trust modifications, and the beginning of a new phase in my relationship with my children. They could choose to meet my conditions and demonstrate that they understood why respect mattered, or they could choose to fight me in court and prove that they valued my money more than my dignity. Either way, I would be fine, because for the first time in months I was the author of my own story rather than a character in someone else's strategic plan. And that knowledge, that sense of reclaimed autonomy, was worth more than any inheritance I could leave behind. 3 weeks into the 60-day deadline, Marcus appeared at my door on a Thursday evening carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since he was 12 years old and had accidentally broken my grandmother's china teacup. There was something different about his demeanor this time, less calculated defiance and more genuine uncertainty. "Mom, can we talk? I brought the financial accounting you requested." I invited him in, and we sat at the kitchen table where we'd had so many conversations over the years, from homework struggles to college applications to career decisions. But this felt different from all those previous talks, weighted with an adult understanding of consequences that hadn't existed when he was younger. Marcus opened the envelope and spread out bank statements, receipts, and a handwritten ledger that looked like it had taken considerable time to prepare. I went through everything, every transaction, every expense. I even tracked down receipts that Sophie had thrown away. I put on my reading glasses and examined the documents. The accounting was meticulous, showing deposits from Airbnb guests, expenses for cleaning supplies and house maintenance, and transfers to personal accounts. What surprised me was how much money had actually been generated and where it had gone. "According to this, you made nearly $18,000 over 6 weeks, not the $12,000 Sophie initially claimed." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. Sophie wasn't being completely honest about the totals. She was also taking a management fee that she hadn't mentioned. A management fee, 20% of gross income plus reimbursement for expenses. She said it was standard for property management service. I looked at the detailed breakdown he'd prepared. Sophie had indeed been paying herself nearly $4,000 for managing a rental business that used my house, my utilities, my furnishings, and my reputation. Meanwhile, the remaining income had been deposited into an account that bore her name exclusively, despite her claims that the money was being held for my benefit. "Did you receive any of this income directly?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sophie gave me $2,000 to help with my rent and car payment. She said it was an advance against future profits." "Future profits from a business neither of you had asked my permission to operate." "Mom, I know how this looks. I know we handled everything wrong. That's why I'm here with this accounting, and why I'm prepared to meet your other conditions as well." I set down the papers and studied my son's face. The arrogance that had characterized our previous conversations was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine recognition of the magnitude of their deception. "What changed your mind?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the table. "Sophie's attorney visit backfired. When Linda Morrison came here to pressure you, it made me realize how far this had escalated. We went from making bad decisions about your house to hiring lawyers to threaten you with litigation. That's not who I want to be." And Sophie, has she come to the same realization? Sophie is convinced that you're being manipulated by your estate attorney. She thinks Margaret Thornfield is taking advantage of your anger to generate legal fees. She's considering hiring a different lawyer, one who specializes in elder abuse cases. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Elder abuse cases. She thinks she can argue that modifying your trust while emotionally distressed constitutes self-abuse, and that your attorney had an obligation to prevent you from making decisions that weren't in your best interest. Does Sophie understand that pursuing an elder abuse claim would require her to argue that I'm mentally incompetent? I don't think she's thought through all the implications. She's desperate, Mom. Losing your financial support and forfeiting her inheritance would essentially bankrupt her. I thought about the credit card statements I'd reviewed, the charges for expensive restaurants and designer clothes and weekend trips that Sophie had justified as business networking expense. I thought about the car payment I'd been covering for 8 months while she used rental income from my house to pay herself a management fee. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe I'm mentally competent to make decisions about my own assets? Of course. Do you believe the trust modifications were made under duress or undue influence? He hesitated. I think you were angry when you made them, but I also think you had every right to be angry. Do you think anger automatically invalidates decision-making capacity? No, actually I think anger sometimes clarifies things that we've been avoiding. You were angry because we violated your trust and your autonomy. That anger led you to protect yourself from future violations. That seems like rational decision-making to me. I reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. Thank you for saying that. Mom, I want to meet your conditions, all of them. I want to provide the financial accounting, write the acknowledgement letter, and develop a plan for rebuilding your trust. But I need to know if it's possible to rebuild your trust, or if this is just an elaborate way of disinheriting us while making it look like our choice. The question caught me off guard with its directness. I realized that despite all our conversations about the specific conditions, we hadn't discussed the larger question of whether forgiveness was actually possible. Marcus, 3 weeks ago I would have said that forgiveness was automatic, that family relationships could survive any betrayal as long as people were willing to apologize. But this situation has taught me that some violations cut deeper than others. What do you mean? You and Sophie didn't just take my money or use my house. You decided that your judgment about my best interests was more important than my own preferences. You treated me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a person whose autonomy deserved respect. That kind of violation goes to the core of who I am as an individual. Marcus absorbed this quietly. So forgiveness is possible, but it requires us to understand why our actions were so harmful. Forgiveness is possible if you can demonstrate that you understand the difference between helping me and controlling me, and that you're committed to respecting my autonomy going forward. The written acknowledgement isn't about humiliation. It's about ensuring that you understand why respect matters. And if Sophie refuses to meet the conditions, then Sophie will forfeit her inheritance, and my assets will go to people who have consistently treated me with dignity. Marcus nodded slowly. Can I ask who those people are? You mentioned Mrs. Henderson and your hairdresser, but I'm curious about the full list. I had given this considerable thought over the past 3 weeks, researching the legal requirements for charitable bequests and individual gifts. Ms. Henderson will receive enough to ensure her comfort for the rest of her life. Janet, my hairdresser, will receive a sum that recognizes 20 years of treating me like a complete human being rather than just an elderly client. The scholarship fund will support students who are the first in their families to attend college, because I remember how hard it was to navigate higher education without family guidance. And the senior center will receive funding specifically for programs that support elderly people's independence rather than assuming they need to be managed. Those are thoughtful choices. They reflect my values better than automatically passing everything to children who see my assets as their future security rather than my current autonomy. Marcus gathered up the financial documents and slid them back into the envelope. I'm going to meet your conditions. I'm going to write the acknowledgement letter and develop a rebuilding plan that demonstrates I understand why respect matters. I can't speak for Sophie, but I can speak for myself. What will you say in your acknowledgement letter? He thought for a moment. I'll acknowledge that we violated your trust by using your property without permission, that we manipulated you into compliance through deception, and that we prioritized our financial interests over your autonomy. I'll explain that I understand why those actions were harmful, not just because they made you angry, but because they treated you as less than a complete person. And your rebuilding plan? I'll commit to consulting you before making any decisions that affect your life or your property. I'll establish financial independence so our relationship isn't complicated by money, and I'll support your right to make choices I might disagree with, because autonomy means the right to make your own decisions, not just the right to make decisions other people approve of. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. That sounds like someone who understands why respect matters. After Marcus left, I sat in my living room and thought about the difference between his visit tonight and our previous conversation. The change wasn't just in his willingness to meet my conditions, it was in his understanding of why the conditions existed. He had moved from seeing my requirements as arbitrary punishment to recognizing them as necessary protection for my autonomy. The next morning, Sophie called while I was having breakfast. "Mom, Marcus told me he's planning to meet your ridiculous conditions. I think you need to understand that his decision doesn't validate your position." "Good morning, Sophie." "Don't good morning. We need to talk about what you're doing to this family." "What I'm doing to this family is requiring its members to treat me with respect. What you're doing is using money as a weapon to force compliance with unreasonable demands." Marcus may be willing to humiliate himself by writing some groveling letter admitting wrongdoing he doesn't believe he committed, but I'm not. I buttered my toast carefully, taking time to consider my response. "Sophie, can you explain to me why acknowledging that you used my property without permission constitutes humiliation?" "Because it's not that simple. We didn't use your property, we maximized its potential while encouraging you to live a more active lifestyle. We didn't deceive you. We delayed telling you about arrangements we knew you'd resist until we could prove they worked. We didn't violate your trust. We exercised good judgment on your behalf when you were too stubborn to see the benefits yourself." There it was, the fundamental disconnect that made resolution impossible. Sophie genuinely believed that her version of events was accurate, that my objections were character flaws rather than legitimate preferences, that her judgment about my best interest should override my own autonomy. "Sophie, do you believe I have the right to refuse arrangements that I don't want, even if those arrangements might be financially beneficial?" "I believe you have the right to make informed decisions. But I also believe that when someone is making decisions based on fear or stubbornness rather than logic, the people who love them have an obligation to intervene." "And who decides whether my decisions are based on fear and stubbornness rather than logic?" "People who aren't emotionally invested in maintaining the status quo." "You mean people like you and Marcus? People who can see the situation objectively?" I set down my coffee cup and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had spent so many peaceful mornings together. He would have been appalled by this conversation, by the casual way our daughter was dismissing my right to control my own life. "Sophie, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. You do not get to decide whether my preferences are logical or emotional. You do not get to override my choices because you disagree with them. You do not get to use my property for your financial benefit without my consent, regardless of how beneficial you believe those arrangements might be for me. So you'd rather be lonely and financially stagnant than allow the people who love you to help you build a better life. I'd rather be autonomous and dignified than managed and optimized." That's exactly the kind of emotional thinking that got us into this situation in the first place. I hung up the phone and stood in the quiet of my kitchen, understanding finally that Sophie would never meet my conditions because she would never understand why they were necessary. In her mind, my desire for autonomy was the problem, not her violation of. That afternoon, I called Margaret Thornfield to discuss what would happen if only one of my children met the inheritance conditions. "The trust modifications allow for individual compliance," Margaret explained. "If Marcus meets the conditions and Sophie doesn't, Marcus would inherit his portion, and Sophie would forfeit hers. The forfeited assets would be distributed according to the alternative beneficiary or provisions you established. And if Sophie challenges the trust in court, then she'll be arguing that you lacked the mental capacity to protect yourself from her unauthorized use of your property. It's not a strong legal position, especially given the thorough documentation we've prepared." "What kind of documentation?" "Medical records confirming your mental competency, detailed notes from our consultations showing your clear understanding of the legal implications, witness statements from people who can attest to your decision-making capacity, and financial records demonstrating that your trust modifications were based on concrete evidence of your children's actions, rather than emotional reactions." "Witness statements?" "Mrs. Henderson has agreed to provide a statement about your mental acuity and decision-making capacity. Your physician has confirmed that your last cognitive assessment showed no signs of impairment, and I've prepared detailed documentation of our consultation process showing that you understood all the legal implications of your decisions and considered alternatives before proceeding. I felt relieved knowing that Sophie's potential legal challenge would be met with thorough preparation, but I also felt sad that such preparation was necessary, that my own daughter was willing to argue that I was mentally incompetent, rather than acknowledge that she had violated my trust. The following week, Marcus delivered his written acknowledgement and rebuilding plan. The documents were thoughtful and detailed, demonstrating genuine understanding of why his actions had been harmful and specific commitments for respecting my autonomy going forward. In his acknowledgement letter, he wrote, "I understand that using your house for commercial purposes without your knowledge or consent was a violation of your property rights and your trust. I understand that manipulating you into leaving home so strangers could use your private living space was a violation of your privacy and autonomy. I understand that presenting our business decisions as favors we were doing for you was manipulative and dishonest. Most importantly, I understand that treating your preferences as obstacles to be managed rather than rights to be respected was fundamentally wrong, regardless of our intentions." His rebuilding plan included specific commitments: establishing complete financial independence within 6 months, consulting me before making any decisions that might affect my life or property, supporting my right to make choices he disagreed with, and maintaining regular communication that respected my autonomy rather than trying to manage my decisions. "This is exactly what I was hoping to see," I told him when he brought the documents over. "You understand that this isn't about the money, it's about respect. I do understand that now. And Mom, I want you to know that even if the inheritance weren't a factor, I'd want to rebuild our relationship on these terms. I don't want to be the kind of person who manages other people's lives for their own good." "What changed your perspective?" Marcus sat down at the kitchen table and looked around the room where he'd grown up. "I started thinking about how I'd feel if someone treated me the way we treated you. If my future in-laws decided my apartment wasn't being used efficiently and started renting it out while manipulating me into being absent, I'd be furious. If they presented their business decisions as favors they were doing for me, I'd feel patronized and violated. And if they dismissed my objections as emotional overreactions that proved I needed their management, I'd cut them out of my life entirely. And Sophie, have you talked to her about your decision? Sophie thinks I'm being weak and that you're manipulating me into compliance. She's convinced that if we both refuse to meet your conditions, you'll eventually back down rather than actually disinherit us." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you're not the same person you were 6 months ago. That having your trust violated changes something fundamental about how you see relationships. And that gambling our inheritance on the assumption that you're bluffing is incredibly foolish." "How did she respond?" "She said that family relationships should be based on love and forgiveness, not legal contracts and conditional inheritance. She said you're destroying our family over money." I thought about this characterization, about the way Sophie framed my actions as destroying the family rather than protecting myself. It was consistent with her pattern of making me responsible for the consequences of her choices. "Marcus, do you think family relationships should be based on love and forgiveness?" "I think they should be based on mutual respect. Love without respect is just sentiment. Forgiveness without accountability is just enabling." 2 weeks before the 60-day deadline, Sophie made one final attempt to change my mind. She arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, carrying flowers and wearing the kind of dress she knew I'd always liked on her. "Mom, I've been thinking about our situation, and I want to propose a compromise." I let her in, though I was wary of what kind of compromise she might have in mind. "I'm willing to acknowledge that we made some mistakes with the Airbnb situation. I'm willing to provide financial accounting and even pay you back for any income you feel should belong to you. But I can't write the kind of acknowledgement letter you're requiring, because it would essentially be admitting to wrongdoing that could have legal implications." "What kind of legal implications are you worried about?" "If I admit in writing that we violated your trust and autonomy, that document could be used against me if you ever decided to pursue legal action for theft or fraud." I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of the girl who used to curl up next to me to read bedtime stories. She was still there, somewhere underneath the careful calculation, but she was buried under layers of self-protection that made genuine connection impossible. Sophie, are you worried about legal action because you believe you committed theft or fraud? I'm worried about legal action because you're clearly angry and people make unpredictable decisions when they're angry. I'm not angry anymore, Sophie. I'm sad. I'm disappointed. I'm concerned about what your refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing says about your character, but I'm not angry. Then why won't you consider a compromise that allows us to move forward without forcing me to admit to criminal behavior? Because moving forward requires acknowledging what went wrong. If you can't acknowledge that using my property without permission was a violation of my rights, then you haven't learned anything from this experience. Sophie sat down on the couch and put her head in her hand. Mom, I'm going to lose everything. Without your financial support and without my inheritance, I'll have to declare bankruptcy. I'll lose my apartment, my car, everything I've worked for. You could avoid bankruptcy by meeting the conditions I've established. I can't admit to wrongdoing I don't believe I committed. Then you've made your choice. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. How can you do this to your own daughter? How can you choose money over family? I'm not choosing money over family. Sophie, you're choosing pride over accountability. The conditions exist because you violated my trust. Meeting them would demonstrate that you understand why trust matters. Refusing to meet them demonstrates that you value your own self-image more than our relationship. But the consequences are so disproportionate to what we actually did. The consequences are proportionate to your refusal to acknowledge what you actually did. Sophie stood up and walked to the door. Fine. If you want to disinherit me over this, go ahead. But don't pretend it's about anything other than revenge. It's not about revenge, Sophie. It's about protecting myself from future violations of my autonomy. By people who love you and want what's best for you. By people who think their judgment about what's best for me should override my own preferences. After she left, I sat in my living room and thought about the conversation I'd just had. Sophie had offered to provide financial accounting and even financial restitution, but she couldn't acknowledge that her actions had been wrong. She could admit to making mistakes, but not to violating my rights. She could offer to move forward but not to change the fundamental dynamic that had made the violations possible in the first place. The 60-day deadline arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus had met all the conditions 3 days early, demonstrating not just compliance, but genuine understanding of why the conditions existed. Sophie had not submitted any of the required documents, despite multiple reminders about the approaching deadline. That afternoon, I called Margaret Thornfield to confirm the final disposition of my estate. Marcus will inherit his portion according to the original trust provisions. Margaret said, Sophie's portion will be distributed according to the alternative beneficiary or provisions you establish. The changes take effect immediately, and if Sophie challenges this in court, then she'll be arguing that you were mentally incompetent when you decided to protect yourself from her unauthorized use of your property. As I've mentioned before, it's not a strong legal position. That evening, I called Marcus to let him know that he had successfully met all the inheritance conditions. Thank you, Mom. Not just for the inheritance, but for teaching me something important about respect and autonomy. What did you learn? That loving someone doesn't give you the right to control them, that good intentions don't justify bad actions, and that real relationships require accountability, not just sentiment. Those are important lessons. I'm sorry it took this situation for me to learn them. I also called Miss Henderson to let her know about her inheritance. Mabel, I'm honored that you thought of me, but I don't need your money. Eleanor, this isn't about need, it's about recognizing people who have treated me with consistent respect and kindness. You've been a wonderful neighbor and friend, and I want to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life. In that case, I accept gratefully. And Mabel, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Too many people our age just accept being managed by their children instead of demanding respect. Finally, I called Sophie to inform her that the deadline had passed and she had forfeited her inheritance. You're really doing this. You're really disinheriting me. You disinherited yourself by refusing to acknowledge that you violated my trust. I hope you're satisfied with your revenge. I'm satisfied with my autonomy. That night, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow I would wake up knowing that my assets were under my complete control, that my house belonged entirely to me, that my future was determined by my own choices rather than other people's plans for my optimization. The journey had been painful, but it had taught me something important about the difference between family relationships based on love and family relationships based on respect. Love could exist without respect, but it wasn't enough to sustain healthy relationships. Respect required acknowledging other people's autonomy, even when you disagreed with their choices. It required understanding that caring about someone meant supporting their right to control their own life, not managing their decisions for their own good. Marcus had learned this lesson and earned back his place in my life. Sophie had rejected it and forfeited her inheritance. The consequences were sad but appropriate. I had protected myself from future violations of my autonomy, and I had sent a clear message about the importance of treating elderly people with dignity rather than assuming they needed to be managed. For the first time in months, I felt entirely at peace with my life and my choices. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner for 3 people instead of the large family gatherings I'd once hosted. Marcus arrived promptly at noon, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the relaxed expression of someone who no longer carried the weight of deception. Miss Henderson came through the back door with her famous apple pie, moving slowly but steadily with her walker. "Something smells wonderful, dear," Eleanor said, settling into the chair at my kitchen table that had become her regular spot for these weekly dinners. "Pot roast, the way Robert used to make it," I replied, checking the vegetables in the oven. "He always said the secret was patience and not rushing the process." Marcus kissed my cheek and uncorked the wine. "How was your week, Mom? Productive?" I finally finished sorting through the attic and found some photo albums I thought were lost forever, and I had lunch with Janet on Wednesday to discuss the scholarship fund. The scholarship fund had become my favorite project over the past few months. Working with the community college to establish criteria for supporting first-generation students had given me a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. Janet had volunteered to help with the selection committee, bringing her practical wisdom and genuine care for young people struggling to better their circumstances. "Any interesting applications this semester?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the details of my work. "A young woman who wants to study nursing so she can support her grandmother, and a man in his 40s who's going back to school after losing his factory job. Both exactly the kind of students Robert would have wanted to help." We talked easily through dinner, the conversation flowing naturally between topics ranging from Marcus's new job, to Eleanor's garden, to my plans for redecorating the guest bedroom. There was something peaceful about these gatherings, something authentic that had been missing from our family meals when every interaction carried the undercurrent of financial dependence and unspoken expectations. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Marcus said as we cleared the dinner dish. "Do you ever hear from Sophie?" I paused in stacking the plates, considering how to answer. "She calls occasionally, usually when she's having financial difficulties and hopes I might have changed my mind about the inheritance." "How do you handle those conversations?" "I listen if she wants to talk about her life, but I don't engage when she tries to relitigate the trust modifications. She's made her choice and I've made mine." Eleanor spoke up from her seat at the table. "That girl brought this on herself, Mark. Your mother gave her every opportunity to make things right." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I just feel guilty sometimes that I met the conditions and she didn't. Like I abandoned her or something." I set down the dishes and turned to face my son. "Marcus, you didn't abandon Sophie. You chose accountability over denial. That's not betrayal. That's growth. But she's struggling financially. She had to move back in with her college roommate, and she's working 2 part-time jobs just to cover basic expenses. Those are the natural consequences of her financial choices over the past several years. My supporting her would just enable her to continue making poor decisions without learning from them." Marcus nodded, though I could see he still carried some guilt about his sister's situation. "She blames you for destroying our family." "Sophie destroyed trust within our family when she decided that her judgment about my best interests was more important than my own preferences. I simply responded to that destruction by protecting myself from future violation." Eleanor reached over and patted Marcus's hand. "Your mother is right, dear. Some people learn from consequences and others just resent them. You can't control which category your sister falls into. After Marcus and Eleanor left, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon when I'd discovered strangers sleeping in my bed. The house felt different now, more settled somehow, as if it had finally exhaled after months of holding its breath. Every room belonged completely to me again, filled with my choices and my routines and my peace. The phone rang, interrupting my thought. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Sophie's name. I considered letting it go to voicemail, as I had with several of her recent calls, but something made me answer. "Hello, Sophie. Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." Her voice sounded different, less combative than usual, though I couldn't quite identify what had changed. "I'm listening. I've been going to therapy, court-ordered actually, because of some issues with my landlord, but the therapist has been helping me understand some things about boundaries and respect that I didn't see before." I set down my teacup and waited for her to continue. She made me write out a timeline of everything that happened with the Airbnb situation, every decision we made, every conversation we had, every time we encouraged you to leave the house, and when I saw it all laid out like that, I started to understand why you were so upset. "What did you understand?" "That we made decisions about your life without including you in those decisions. That we treated your objections as problems to be managed instead of preferences to be respected. That we convinced ourselves we were helping you, while we were actually helping ourselves." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying. "That's a significant recognition, Sophie. I know it's too late to change what I did. I know I missed the deadline for meeting your condition, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand why those conditions existed." "Why now, Sophie? What changed?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I think hitting rock bottom financially forced me to see things I'd been avoiding. When you cut off your support and I lost the inheritance, I had to face the reality of the choices I'd been making. And when I couldn't afford my rent and had to move in with Jessica, I started to understand what it feels like to have other people making decisions about your living situation." "How so?" "Jessica has a lot of opinions about how I should manage my money, how I should look for work, how I should handle my relationship with you, and at first I was grateful for her advice, but then it started to feel controlling, like she thought I was incapable of making good decisions for myself, and that helped you understand how I felt about your management of my life. It helped me understand that good intentions don't justify taking away someone's autonomy. Jessica means well, just like Marcus and I meant well with you, but meaning well doesn't make it okay to override someone else's choices." I walked to the window and looked out at my garden, where the roses were blooming again after a season of careful tending. "Sophie, I appreciate you calling to tell me this. It means something to me that you've gained this understanding. Does it mean enough to give me another chance?" There was the question I'd been expecting, the real reason for her call. Sophie had learned to frame her request differently, but she was still asking me to reverse the consequences of her choices. "Another chance at what, specifically?" "At meeting your conditions, at proving that I understand why respect matters, at being part of your life again." I thought about the 6 months that had passed since the deadline, about the peace I'd found in relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, about the projects and friendships I'd developed when I wasn't constantly managing other people's expectations of my generosity. "Sophie, the inheritance conditions aren't in effect anymore. The 60-day deadline passed, and the trust modifications are permanent, but that doesn't mean we can't rebuild our relationship on different terms." "What kind of terms that acknowledge what happened and focus on moving forward with clear boundaries. Terms that don't involve money or inheritance, just the basic respect that should exist between any two adults." "I'd like that. I'd like to try. Then let's start small. You could come to dinner next Sunday. No discussions about money or inheritance, just conversation between a mother and daughter who are learning to relate to each other as adults. I'd like that very much." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room and thought about forgiveness and accountability, and the difference between enabling someone and giving them space to grow. Sophie's call didn't change the consequences of her actions, but it suggested that those consequences had served their intended purpose, teaching her why respect mattered. The following Sunday, Sophie arrived at my door, carrying a small potted plant, and wearing an expression I recognized from her childhood, nervous, but hopeful. She looked older somehow, less polished than she'd been 6 months ago, but also more genuine. "I brought you something," she said, offering me the plant. "It's a peace lily." I thought that was appropriate. Marcus was already there, helping me set the table, and Eleanor was in the kitchen sharing stories about her late husband's cooking disaster. When Sophie walked in, the dynamic shifted slightly, everyone aware that this was new territory for our family. "Hello, Sophie," Eleanor said warmly but cautiously. "It's good to see you." "Hello, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for welcoming me." Dinner was tentative at first, conversation staying safely in neutral territory of weather and current events, but gradually, as Sophie demonstrated that she wasn't going to push boundaries or revisit old grievances, the atmosphere relaxed into something approaching normal. "Tell me about your therapy," I said when we'd finished the main course. "What else have you learned?" Sophie considered the question carefully. "I've learned that I have a pattern of assuming I know what's best for other people, not just with you, but with friends, coworkers, even strangers. I think I do it because it makes me feel competent and needed, but it's actually pretty arrogant." Marcus nodded. "I recognize that pattern in myself too. The assumption that caring about someone gives you the right to manage their decisions." "Exactly. And I've learned that real caring means supporting someone's right to make their own choices, even when you think those choices are wrong." Eleanor smiled approvingly. "That's wisdom that takes some people their whole lives to learn." Over the following months, Sophie became a regular at our Sunday dinners, though our relationship remained carefully defined within clear boundaries. She didn't ask for money, didn't hint about the inheritance, didn't try to give me advice about how to live my life. Instead, she shared updates about her work, asked about my projects, and gradually demonstrated that she understood the difference between being my daughter and being my manager. The changes weren't just in Sophie's behavior, they were in my own response to her. Without the constant undercurrent of financial manipulation, I found myself genuinely enjoying her company again. She was funny and intelligent, and caring when she wasn't trying to control outcomes for everyone around her. One evening in late fall, as we sat on my back porch watching the sun set, Sophie said something that surprised me. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm not trying to earn my way back into your will." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I understand the inheritance is gone, and I'm okay with that. These dinners, our conversations, the relationship we're building now, this isn't about money, this is about having a mother again." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You've always had a mother, Sophie. What you have now is a mother who feels respect." "I'm sorry it took me so long to learn how to do that." "I'm proud of you for learning it at all." That winter, Marcus announced his engagement to a woman named Sarah who worked as a social worker, and shared his newfound understanding of boundaries and respect. When they came to dinner to share the news, Sarah made a point of asking about my preferences for involvement in the wedding planning, rather than assuming what level of participation I might want. "We'd love to have you as involved as you'd like to be, Miss Crawford, but we also want to make sure we're not putting any pressure on you to take on responsibilities you're not interested in." It was such a small thing, but it represented everything I'd been fighting for: the acknowledgement that I was capable of making my own decisions about my own level of involvement in their lives. The scholarship fund continued to grow, funded not just by my initial contribution, but by small donations from community members who believed in its mission. Janet and I interviewed candidates together, looking for students who demonstrated not just academic potential but genuine resilience and respect for others. It felt good to support young people who understood the value of hard work and personal responsibility. Miss Henderson's health remained stable, and she became a cherished fixture at our family gatherings, offering wisdom and perspective that enriched all our conversation. Her presence also served as a reminder of the kind of relationships that were possible when they were based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence or family obligation. On the first anniversary of discovering the Airbnb scheme, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in 12 months. I'd learned to distinguish between people who cared about me and people who wanted to manage me. I'd discovered that setting boundaries, even painful ones, could ultimately strengthen relationships by forcing them to be based on genuine respect rather than just habit or obligation. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed my sense of autonomy and dignity. I no longer felt like someone whose preferences were obstacles to be overcome, or whose choices needed to be improved by wiser minds. I felt like a complete person whose judgment was respected, and whose autonomy was protected. The house on Maple Street remained mine in every sense of the word, filled with my choices and my peace and my carefully chosen relationships. The blue shutters that Robert had painted still framed the windows, and the garden we'd planted together continued to bloom each season. But the house also felt renewed somehow, as if it had been restored to its intended purpose as a home, rather than an asset to be optimized. That evening, as I sat in my living room with a book and a cup of tea, I thought about Robert and the wisdom he'd shown in structuring our trust to protect my autonomy. He'd understood something that I'd taken years to fully appreciate, that the greatest gift you can give someone isn't financial security, but the assurance that their right to control their own life will be respected and protected. The phone sat silent on the side table, and I felt grateful for that silence. No emergency calls from children who'd made poor financial decisions, no manipulative requests disguised as expressions of concern, just the peaceful quiet of a life lived on my own terms, surrounded by people who understood that love without respect is just sentiment, but love with respect is the foundation of genuine relationship. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.